Hello everybody, I'm coming at you today from the woods of Mississippi to show you some weapons of the Continental Army during the American Revolution. And of course, I wanted to look the part, so I put together a meticulous impression here. I've got my tricorn hat, I have my linen hunting frock here, a waistcoat also of linen, my costrol for when I get thirsty on campaigns, just a little water bottle, of course my linen haversack, and just from head to toe, completely accurate in every sense. So this is what a 1775 New England militiaman would have been dressed like in some early campaigns like the Siege of Boston and Benedict Arnold's invasion of Quebec. But as I understand it, my buddy Karl, who is my collaborator on this video, has an even more meticulously accurate costume. And oh my God, Karl, you look amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I just came back from some sex clubs in France, brought you all some weapons, and I think I look exquisite.
I feel like such a fucking farb next to you. I look like shit. My costume was terrible.
Not everyone can be as cool.
You look amazing.
It's all right.
And I look so shitty.
It'll be okay. It'll be okay. I got guns. Look, guns.
I do like guns.
Yeah, see, guns are fun.
I do like guns.
Yeah. It'll be all right. I mean, you look good. You look all right. I think is this from Spirit?
This is from Townsend's, Karl.
Oh, mine's from Spirit, which is really the highest vendor of reproduction, high quality, historic costuming and uniforms.
I should have gone with Spirit.
You should have gone with Spirit.
Fucking Townsend's. His fucking wholesomeness and his cooking. God, I hate him. Spirit Halloween is where it's at.
That's the future.
It's the future of progressive reenacting. I think we can all agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You want to shoot some guns?
Let's shoot some guns.
Hello, welcome to my Black Void. So as you can probably already tell, Karl and I had a ton of fun making this episode. We went up to a big old field in Lumberton, Mississippi, which was actually the same place we shot that big skeleton battle at the end of Checkmate Lincolnites, and shot some of these wonderful old guns. As you can imagine though, making high quality edutainment is not exactly cheap. I bought this musket specifically for my coverage of the Revolutionary War, which I've been starting this year. So if you like Atun-Shei films, if you appreciate the work that we do here, I really hope you'll consider joining us on Patreon. Patrons get all sorts of benefits, from behind-the-scenes material, extra videos, access to an exclusive Discord server, and more. Other ways to help the channel would be to buy merch or memorabilia from our online store, to give us a one-time donation via PayPal, or to buy or rent The Sudbury Devil, our historical feature film. You can find links to all that stuff down in the description or over on my website, atunshefilms.com. So this is a fusil de chasse from Veteran Arms. It's a reproduction, and it's a pretty good facsimile of what a New England fowling musket would have looked like at the dawn of the Revolutionary War. This is a smoothbore musket, of course, and a muzzle loader, and it really speaks to the quality of the design of flintlocks like these, that a musket of this basic design was a common sight on the American frontier for a century before 1775. Really, the only difference between this musket and the types that would have been carried in conflicts like King Philip's War or King William's War is the lock mechanism. This is what's called a true flintlock. There would have been a slightly different mechanism in the late 17th century called the dog lock. But those are details that really only nerds care about. In terms of its basic design, right? The flint hits the frizzen, ignites the powder in the pan, ignites the powder in the barrel, it goes boom. That basic design went more or less unchanged for about 100 years. When the American Revolution exploded into violence in 1775, this was exactly the type of civilian weapon that a lot of minute and militiamen would take to battles like Lexington and Concord or the Siege of Boston. There's a bit of this misconception that a lot of these guys in the early part of the war in Massachusetts just kind of grabbed the muskets that were on top of their mantelpieces and just marched off to fight the British. But in fact, as I mentioned in my recent video about the Minutemen, the Massachusetts counter-government had actually been stockpiling weapons for months before the shot heard around the world was even first fired. So actually a lot of these guys would have been carrying British-made short land pattern muskets, commonly known as Brown Besses. In fact, the most commonly used type of musket on either side of the Revolutionary War. But as far as there were sort of mantelpiece muskets, as it were, this is the one that they would have used. So let's load this thing up and see how it shoots. All right, so starting off with the musket at half cock. I'm gonna pour a little powder into the pan here. Good, close that. Pour the powder and the ball into the barrel. Ram it home. Reseat the ramrod. Maybe I should have studied that British manual of arms a little bit better. My ramrod skills are not good. Full cock and fire. So what did you think about firing the fusil de chasse?
I mean, all of these flintlock, smoothbore things, to me, are virtually indistinguishable from one another. The comb, by the way, the comb is this part that you put your cheek down on the rifle, or the musket, I should say, is a little different on the fusil.
It is, yeah.
It's meant as a fowling piece, which is meant for looting birdshot and buckshot on game and birds. And that is a more rapid acquisition sight picture, which there isn't really a sight picture, it's like vibes, but for like bird shooting or wing shooting. But the military application changed that because it's stronger, and they weren't worried about shooting at birds.
Yeah, well, it's funny you should mention birds and shooting birds, because the sort of idea of this, the name of this, like a fowler or a hunting gun, is slightly, shall we say, like misleading in terms of its application in a civilian context. Because in fact, there was still like a bit of a stigma in the colonies that like hunting was considered this aristocratic activity. And when, you know, we talked about this as being representative of the type of civilian weapon that would be carried at Lexington and Concord or the Siege of Boston, like very early war. We're talking like eastern Massachusetts, rural towns. You know, this sort of a gun was used in civilian contexts, but not really for hunting by those communities. Now, when you go like to the frontier, it's very much like a different story. But in terms of how this would have actually been used, this was not used like for hunting. People didn't hunt that much. These were animal farmers, right? And so like sort of game animals like birds or like deer was not really a big part of their diet. You know, when they ate meat, it was salt pork or salt beef. You know, they were cow and pig farmers. So that's what I think is sort of a bit misleading about this.
That's interesting.
You know,
yeah.
And what this would have been used sort of more for in terms of a, there's two things that it would have been used for in a civilian context. It would have been used more for self-defense, but not in the way of self-defense as we think of it today. It would be more of what we think of as community defense, service in the militia. You were expected to have your gun so you could then take it to militia training days, to actually being a part of like your local defense force, right? You look at the crime rate in towns like Lexington or Concord, and they were very low, right? There was not really like home invasions. You wouldn't be like grabbing this and, you know, defending my home is my castle. It wasn't really any of that. It was like, okay, every once in a while, we'll go out to the field in the middle of town and we'll like do maneuvers and we'll train as a militia. And this was very culturally important to these people. It's a big family tradition that I talked about in my video about the Minutemen and stuff like that. And the other primary civilian context was shooting animals, but not for sustenance or hunting. It would be to shoot so-called pest animals, the wildlife that would, you know, harass or that they thought would harass their crops or their cows and their pigs. So, you know, they might shoot wolves or coyotes, you know, birds that might be sort of threatening their crop, that kind of thing. As a gun guy, do you have any thoughts about that idea of like the militia as it's sort of understood in early American history and sort of self-defense in the 18th century rather than like a 21st century
We got to take this out of context of now, right? Because this, I mean, these things, I don't think they've evolved. I think this is a political conversation at that point.
Oh, no.
And well, in this space, in the modern world, because there's the argument about the collective versus the individual right. And that is a big one. I believe in individual right. I believe the Constitution enshrined that for the individual self-defense. However, when you hear the words well-regulated militia, that's also been argued, because well-regulated, some people think it means controlled. I think, and I think you can back this up quite easily with the documentation of the time, it means well-trained. And the reason it's well-trained, like you said, they go to the field and prepare for movements, was because at the time, firearms like this do not provide a significant amount of firepower. They are more powerful than a bow and arrow. A bow and arrow, however, has a higher rate of fire with a significant amount of fire supremacy when close enough, as well as the ability to arc fire in, which you can't do with these. So that means once you've fired your shot, you fired your shot. And unlike nowadays where you have a 30-round magazine or a 60-round magazine or some semi-automatic thing, you now have to reload. And therefore the firepower for the individual was minimal. And the fire supremacy on the field for an individual, especially against people armed with even hand weapons, was questionable, right? Provided power, but not a high rate of fire and therefore not fire supremacy. So that well-regulation, i.e. that training where these men learned to work in concert with one another, is what turned each individual musket into a fire team that could then provide fire supremacy. Even though I do believe that the Bill of Rights enshrines it as an individual right, community defense hasn't changed. And that's still a thing that needs to happen regardless of the increase of firepower we have with modern guns. And having cohesion and having people, having a community and doing that together, just like they did then, is just as important now, regardless of the fact that firepower has changed. So community defense is still real. The firepower has changed. But it doesn't change the need.
But obviously the civilian muskets had several drawbacks.
They did.
In the field of battle, which is why we started to move away from that. And as the Continental Army started to become professional, we started to move to a more military weapon.
So this is a 69 caliber Charleville musket, and this really represents the French coming into the American Revolutionary cause. Now, this one has been heavily modified from its original incarnation. However, this still is what would have been a military musket. The military musket, compared to the fusil de chassis, the civilian smoothbore musket, really in function is identical. It is a flintlock, it is a smoothbore, firing either a round ball or some sort of buck-and ball, really the precursor to a shotgun or a fowling piece. But the difference between the civilian musket and the military musket is kind of nuanced. It was more rigid and built to stronger specifications and therefore a little more expensive so that it would be more durable in the field. And the best example of that would be the ramrod. The ramrod on this military style musket is steel. You might ask, well, won't that damage the muzzle? It's a smoothbore, we don't care. But on that fusil de chassis, you'll notice that frequently it is a wooden ramrod, and under stress, when you're ramming the ammunition home, you could easily break that. And if you break your ramrod, you have a no longer functional gun. That is one example of a difference between a civilian and military musket. Another one would be the ability to accept a bayonet. The fusil de chassis or many civilian muskets did not have that functionality, while the military ones did. As was already mentioned, many of the flintlocks on this Revolutionary War on the American side were already British Brown Bess land patterns, but when the French came in, this was actually considered the superior musket to the Brown Bess. In fact, French weapons at that time were prized and treasured, and a significant number came in for the American cause. Now this one, as you can see, has been a little modified. That's because after the end of the Revolutionary War, the Americans liked the Charleville so much that they essentially copied it nearly identically and made the 1795 Springfield. And therefore all of these French muskets that were sitting in the inventory were sort of second tier. Some of them went to existing militia forces, but a significant number went to civilian hands or were sold or traded off. And while a quote-unquote trade musket was a lower cost, lower quality musket usually from France that was used for trading with the indigenous peoples, when these became surplus weapons, they also frequently became trade muskets, and that's what you see here. And the indigenous folks that received these or purchased them or acquired them through trade frequently made very smart modifications to them. One, they personalized them. This tack work makes it, you know that it's your gun. And when you're firing your gun at that time, you know the idiosyncrasies of that gun. Does it shoot left? Does it shoot high? Knowing your gun matters. They also cut them down. The original Charlevilles were essentially the same length as the Brown Bess, but when you cut these down, one, it's more handy in the field, and also, when you're firing it with that long lock time, it actually makes it more accurate and easier to shoot and hit targets. Because if you flinch at all, the shorter barrel actually means that that bullet leaves the barrel sooner and you're more likely to hit what you're aiming at. But other than that, this is a good representation of a military grade Charleville musket. We're gonna go shoot that right now. All right, command to load has been given. I pull a paper cartridge out of my cartridge box. and tear the tail. With the gun at half cock, fill the pan with powder. Close the frizzen. Pour the rest of the powder down the barrel and seat the projectile. Now we use our metal ramrod, military gun, more durable ramrod, to seat that charge fully. Reseat our ramrod. At the command ready, full cock. At the command to aim, we aim. At the command to fire, we fire. Rinse and repeat. The Charleville firearms, the French military weapons, were considered by many the best military weapons of their time, which is funny to anyone watching this now that there's a lot of denigration of French weapons, especially from World War I and World War II, which is actually not fair. They actually did a lot of good work and made a lot of good weapons, and just the fact that they had some issues in World War II doesn't mean that they weren't incredible military. So that's an unfair bias. But when we think about the time of the American Revolution, these French weapons were considered the best of their time, considered superior to the Brown Bess in terms of quality of manufacture. The French weapons were typically 69 caliber. The British weapons are typically 75 caliber. Doesn't make a difference in practice, but it does mean, and this is an interesting one, don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but it does mean the British guns could technically fire American ammunition, but not the other way around.
Oh, interesting.
Because the bigger bore, it's going to bounce, but you could still load it. I don't know if that really happened, but that's something worth looking into. Yeah. But the difference in 69 to 75 caliber is not a difference in terms of ballistics on the battlefield. They're really the equivalent, in, if you want to think of modern firearms, essentially very similar to being hit with a 12-gauge slug. So if you think of everyone out there shooting these, you have an army of people with 12-gauge shotguns firing slugs. That's really what this is like.
Yeah.
The ballistics, the trajectory is all very similar. Modern slugs are more accurate because they've done some magic there. But really, 100 yards, you can hit a man. 50 yards, you can absolutely hit a man. Yeah. Closer than 50 yards, you can actually start doing stuff like, let's aim for his nugget.
Yeah.
But that said, it was more about a field of fire, a volley of fire on that line of men. You might aim at him. It didn't really matter if you hit the other one, quite honestly. Yeah. In fact, buck and ball was for that, which is kind of shotgun-like. You'd have one big ball and a couple smaller balls, which gave you like a pattern. Disciplined soldiers would try to aim. Sometimes undisciplined ones would do like this because they didn't want the fire and smoke in their face. But other than that, I mean, Brown Bess, Charleville, almost the same weight, almost the same length, functionally identical. Just the Charlevilles were considered a little higher quality.
Yeah, well, and also it kind of, I think symbolically, you know, the Charleville, both Brown Besses and Charlevilles used by the Continental Army, but of course the Charleville represented something politically, right? It represented French involvement, represented this sort of new stage of the fighting, which began after Saratoga, you know, and the French were supplying, you know, clandestinely, like any, you know, proxy war today, you know, or before or since, clandestinely supplying Charlevilles to the Americans before they officially joined. But, you know, after the French enter the war and the revolution becomes this global conflict, where, you know, the Spanish are, you know, marching up from New Orleans, you know, actually right around where we're filming this video, you know, would have been marching up from New Orleans over to Pensacola, to the British holdings in Florida, just to kind of needle them and harass them. You know, we start to see as the Continental Army professionalizes, the British find themselves fighting a war on a lot of fronts, right? And we have, I mean, huge numbers of these guns are then brought to the colonies and put in the hands of colonial troops. And, you know, and it just becomes one more kind of card stacked against the British toward their inevitable defeat. And this particular musket here, I mean, that was probably used by an indigenous warrior in, what, the early 19th century?
As I understand it, I actually acquired this from a trading post in New Mexico, from one of these guys that still does like Mountain Men Rendezvous stuff. But this one was sold off of the Blackfoot Reservation and went through a couple civilian hands and landed up in that trading post. So yes, this would have been used in the Revolutionary War. It was surplused out. At some point it got cut down and modified and decorated and made its path across the United States to New Mexico, where it landed up in my hands.
That's wild.
And here we are shooting it today.
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
It's amazing.
Yeah,
very cool. It's a piece of history. It's like shooting some of those antiques like that. I don't know how to put it any other way. You can really feel the machine spirit when you're firing the gun, which is very cool. However, why don't we have a Pennsylvania or Kentucky rifle out here today? A rifle.
It's a good question, Carl.
I mean, isn't that what the Americans won with?
Yeah, you know, that's what people will tell you, you know. Yeah, honestly, you know, we didn't really feel like we needed to have a long rifle here at Guns That Killed Redcoats because, hot take, I don't think that the rifled musket played a particularly large role in the American war effort or the American victory. I think it was like the subject of flashy stories, you know, which were widespread at the time and often, in fact, struck fear into the hearts of British officers, you know. Everybody was paranoid about getting picked off by Daniel Morgan's, you know, company of sharpshooters, the Virginians who were said to, you know, hit like 9 shots out of 10 on like directly onto a nail or something like that. You know, they were renowned for their accuracy. But in fact, you know, the rifle on the battlefield was wildly impractical a lot of the time, you know. And there's this misconception, right, that people in the 18th century during sort of the line infantry days were just like total idiots who were just like, well, you know, we just should line up and shoot at each other. And, you know, they were not stupid, right? Like this was not, you know, they wouldn't, if it didn't work, they wouldn't have done it. You know what I'm saying? Like the fact is that line infantry warfare was the best way to, you know, let's call it what it is, murder large numbers of people with the technology that was available on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution, right? That was simply the best tactic
And to take ground.
available, you know? And, you know, there's that, this has been shown in media a lot, like The Patriot, you know, where, you know, Mel Gibson says, you know, we will shoot officers at the outset of every engagement, and Jason Isaacs says, how dare you, sir, or whatever. The Great Whitest Kids You Know sketch, if you remember that one, where Zach Kreger is the British officer saying, you know, oh, you shot 2 volleys, now you must let us shoot 2, and meanwhile the sharpshooters are picking off all of his guys. But in actual fact, when it came down to it, on the field of battle, you know, sharpshooters and riflemen from the American frontier, from Pennsylvania, Kentucky, the Virginia sharpshooters of Captain Morgan, you know, they were skilled, but they were undisciplined, they were rowdy, they were, you know, other troops resented them and the privileges that they had as like the special elite units, and they weren't very good soldiers, you know. Their rifles took a long time to load.
Yeah.
They could only really be screened as sort of this light infantry troop, and they were very susceptible to bayonet charges. Like if the British got close, they would just destroy the rifle companies, you know? And, you know, don't take my word for it, Daniel Morgan himself told a North Carolina officer during the war, there's a great quote about it, where he basically said something like this: "My riflemen would have been of little service if we had not always had a line of musket and bayonet men to support us. It is this that gives them confidence. They know if the enemy charges them, they have a place to retreat to and are not beat clear off." I think, as you're hearing it from the horse's mouth, that he himself, the most famous rifleman of the Revolution, is saying, without musketeers and artillery, we were really pretty useless.
They were specialists. And it's actually, there's a lot of this akin with modern warfare because these things don't change that much. You have your infantry and you have specialists. Think of the riflemen in the American Revolution as your designated marksmen. They're behind, hitting some high value targets, laying down some precision fire where needed. But the minute that they, like you said, if the enemy closes ranks, they're in trouble because the weapon that they have isn't meant for that sort of combat.
But of course, long guns weren't appropriate for absolutely every battlefield scenario. And we have here the pistol version of the Charleville, which would have been used primarily in 2 military contexts during the Revolution: in cavalry skirmishes and also on board a ship, when 2 ships came within musket range of one another and actually came to grips. Now, cavalry actually didn't play a huge role in the American Revolution, especially up north, where the Appalachian terrain of roots and rocks just kind of made large numbers of horses impractical. But in the southern colonies, during the brutal partisan warfare, which happened in places like the Carolinas and Georgia, cavalry had a much larger role. Finding cavalry-appropriate weapons like pistols, carbines, and swords was always a bit of a challenge for the Americans during the Revolutionary War. But as with a lot of partisan forces, you know, individuals within their units would have a lot of personalization to their equipment. And if you had a little bit of cash to throw around as a cavalry officer, you could actually be very elaborately armed with all sorts of pistols and blades and, you know, kind of like a Rick O'Connell and the Mummy type thing where you fire off 2 pistols and you got 2 more hanging around your neck. But where these pistols saw the most use was probably at sea, in the absolutely hellish hand-to-hand combat which occurred when sailors would board an enemy ship. One of the most memorable instances of this happening was in September 1779, when the USS Bonhomme Richard, a Franco-American merchant vessel refitted as a warship, engaged the HMS Serapis, a 44-gun frigate. The two ships first encountered one another off the coast of Yorkshire in the North Sea, and neither were sure of the other's identity until they got within hailing distance, and then all hell broke out just all at once. They started unleashing full broadsides into the other ship at point-blank distance, and sailors on each deck and up in the tops and the rigging started shooting pistols at the other sailors, across from and below them. And right at the first broadside, two of the Richard's cannons exploded, killing almost everybody in their gun crews. One 19th century historian described what spectators on the shore of Flamborough Head, just 3 nautical miles away, were seeing as they watched these two ships come into grips with one another.
Both ships were enveloped in such a cloud of smoke as to be quite invisible. It seemed as though a thunder cloud, fraught with the most dreadful tempests, had descended upon the ocean, and that a supernatural strife was raging there between unseen spirits of darkness, who hurled bolts at each other, which illumined the ocean and shook the hills.
Realizing that he was losing the artillery duel, the Richard's captain, the legendary American naval commander John Paul Jones, ordered that grappling hooks be thrown onto the Serapis, and that brought the two ships just immediately together. At some points, the muzzles of their cannons were actually kissing and touching each other, and yet the gun crews were still pouring 18-pound cannonballs into each other at point-blank range. Absolutely brutal. It was a true fight to the death, with cannon, pistol, sword, and hatchet. And though the Americans eventually prevailed, the Richard was completely destroyed. John Paul Jones and his crew actually had to escape their ship before it sank so that they could take command of the surrendered Serapis. So let's see if Karl and I can channel our inner John Paul Jones by shooting the Charleville pistol. At half cock, take one of our specialized pistol cartridges. By now, y'all know the drill. Get our powder in the pan. Put that down. Powder in the barrel. It's just like the Charleville, except miniature. It's just like a Minuteman, except mini, if you will. We got that down. And we are ready to claim satisfaction. Lords, slave Tradington, you have fucked my wife, and now you will pay with your life. I have taken the field. Sodomy for everyone. So Karl, this pistol was a ton of fun. Yep. I really channeled my inner Barry Lyndon there, and yeah, that was a blast.
Fantastic. Yeah, literally a blast.
Literally a blast.
Charleville pistol, Charleville musket. If you look at the camera, they're identical. Yeah. These parts are interchangeable, right? Essentially, close to it. The lock work, identical. It's just this smaller. Yeah. In fact, the same paper cartridges will work in both. They're both 69 caliber. However, if you were to load the full battle charge that you put into the pistol, you are overcharging the gun. The recoil will be extreme. And with enough time, you'll start doing things like breaking the stock. So there were different paper cartridges for both guns. You would have a musket paper cartridge and a pistol paper cartridge. They were just all the only difference was the powder charge. Less powder for this, more powder for that. That said, if you knew what you're doing and you were clever and you only had musket cartridges, you could in a pinch load the whole charge in here and deal with the wampa wampa, or you could just pour not all the powder in. Yeah. A lot of combat and a lot of manual arms back then was, I don't know how to put it, vibes. There ain't no sights on this. You just kind of point. This has a front post, and that's got like a front block on it.
Yeah. It's got a little, yeah.
Think of a very gross bead on a modern shotgun. It's vibes. It's vibes. That said, this one for sure I've gotten there with this. If you practice with any of these enough, you learn the vibes of your gun. I can hit a man-sized target at 100 yards with this regularly. You just got to learn the gun.
You know, the experience of shooting this gun has really taught me that this is a very desperate weapon for a desperate situation, right? If I've got my Fowler or my military musket, I'm a safe distance away from the enemy. I'm with my guys. I'm in my regiment. This is like a melee weapon, which is sort of weird to say because it is a firearm. But I mean, to be able to accurately get like a headshot or something with that, you got to be pretty close. And as soon as you fire that, you're probably not going to have time to reload, and you'll either have to get another pistol if you have one, or a bladed weapon, which of course would have been all over the battlefields of the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, I mean, the only reason you're using a pistol is because you don't have a musket, right? That's just how that works. Effective and powerful within its use, and carrying many of them is not a bad idea. There's that famous line out of Blackbeard the Pirate with like 8 pistols on, right? But once this is empty, it's empty. You can turn it around. You've got a club. It's something. That's there for that. But when you talk about bladed weapons, that's interesting because when cultures collide, whether it is combative or friendly, those cultures tend to mix together, regardless of the reason or situation. And we see that with bladed weapons, very interestingly, in the American Revolution, because the Algonquian language brought us the word tomahawk. And tomahawks were used quite a bit by the American forces, not only in the French and Indian War, but continued as a tradition on the frontier, but on the American side of the conflict during the Revolution. The tomahawk is a very effective tool. You can use it to chop wood. You can use it for fieldcraft. In a pinch, you can throw it. You throw tomahawks, you don't throw knives. That's not a thing. Knife throwing's movie stuff. Tomahawks, you can get pretty good at that. Yeah. But at the same time, you don't want to throw away your only weapon either. But a tomahawk in the right hands, as the Americans saw when engaging with the indigenous forces, is not something to trifle with. Tomahawks came in all sorts of shapes and sizes. There's no particularly standardized tomahawk. There wasn't like a military issue tomahawk. So you might have a little one like this or a bigger one, but they weren't generally large. They weren't an axe. Like they weren't meant to be specifically for that purpose. They weren't like a battle axe, right? They were something that was handy and small that you could stick on your belt, pull it out when you needed it, throw it if you needed to, which kind of gives you an indication of the size of it, right? And that's what we have here, essentially a small axe.
There is this sort of, I feel this common misconception. I feel like this video is full of common misconceptions, as is, lots of Revolutionary War history, to be fair. There's this sort of common misconception that between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, it was just Stone Age tribes and like intrepid white frontiersmen, you know what I mean? Fur trappers and living with Indians, and that was kind of it. But this was its own kind of world, of a lot of diversity and sort of cosmopolitan in nature. You had people of European descent and of strange kind of like exotic forms of European descent. You had Finns and Swedes on the frontier. You had all sorts of Germans, all sorts of different types of European people, all sorts of different types of African people living in and amongst, Indian towns or indigenous communities, although it's even hard to call them that because they were so mixed culturally. It was a melting pot. So you had, your fur trappers, of course, your French missionaries, those sorts of people, but you also had, immigrants of speaking every imaginable European language. You had escaped enslaved people. You had, free people of color, sort of doing many of the same jobs that we traditionally think of as being these sort of white frontier jobs, like fur trapping and stuff like that. And of course, the Native Americans themselves, who at this point had sort of an economy and were living lives that would have been just utterly unrecognizable to their ancestors just like a few generations prior, right? I mean, this is a landscape that is completely changed by European contact. Just from the participation in the market economy to just the political bands, the polities and the nations that were like formed around that time, most of them like post-date European contact, formed as a response of like European genocides and colonization, and even the tomahawk itself, as, often was a trade item, made of steel, which is not, indigenous to North America, right?
Not. It would have been treasured, though, for its strength and reliability.
Of course, but even this is sort of an evidence of that cultural exchange, and so many of the native dress at this time, they not only would have had bows and arrows, but muskets and all sorts of, and traditional weapons, European weapons, a mixture of so many different cultures sort of colliding on that frontier.
This time in history, well, actually, so all of history, really.
Here, take the talking tomahawk.
The talking tomahawk. When we talk about the American Revolution, is so Euro-American centric that that part is completely ignored.
And when the revolution came, you know, Native Americans in the Eastern Woodlands had sharply different opinions on it, right? Some thought that their nations should join with the British. Some thought they should join with the Americans. Many, probably most, wanted to stay neutral, right? And this was not necessarily, you know, oh, one tribe went this way, one tribe went that way. This conflict exacerbated existing divisions in the community and tore communities apart, right? So you would have, you know, like ambitious young warriors who were maybe charismatic, and maybe, you know, the sachem was kind of old and doddering and not quite with it. And they would kind of use this crisis as an opportunity to either secede from their nation or take power or start a civil war, you know. And so very quickly we started to see in places like the Ohio River Valley, you know, which is kind of the famous frontier. It's in all the Cecil B. DeMille movies from the 40s, you know, just a bloodbath among, you know, between settlers and indigenous people, and also settlers and killing each other, indigenous people killing each other, just a true Wild West type of situation happening. And, you know, most sachems at this time were playing a very delicate game of diplomacy because they were being courted by both the British and the Americans. So, you know, you had, you know, Indian agents, you know, so-called, coming from British Canada and sort of making promises. Then you had Americans coming from places like Boston or New York and, like, you know, either telling people to, you know, just stay out of it or to trying to entice them to join their side. And, you know, this would have been a life or death decision, and often was for a lot of these sachems, because they knew very well that if they chose the wrong side, the consequences would be the loss of their sovereignty, or in many cases, and this played out historically, their very survival, like individually. I mean, they would, you know, many indigenous communities that sided with the British were completely destroyed and wiped out by the Americans.
Although, in the long run, it kind of went that way anyway. Not necessarily completely destroyed, but sovereignty was lost, right? What you're talking about here, though, we're talking 1775. This type of politics and putting these people in the middle of that continued through the 1880s. Well, continues to 2025, let's be realistic. Yeah. But when we talk about like open armed conflict, 1880s, you have Apache scouts siding with American cavalry to seek out renegade Apaches. Like, this is still going on. You have Tohono O'odham allying with the Americans against the Apache, and in some instances working together to massacre people, and vice versa. Like, and so these types of alliances, which ultimately never worked out, frankly, in the long run for the indigenous nations, they bought time. They didn't buy sovereignty. Continued for 100+ years. Up to now, 2025, this is still an issue, right? Water and oil pipeline rights. Still caught in the middle. It might not be British and American. It's nation versus oil company.
Yeah, Shell.
But it's still the same paradigm.
But, you know, all that said, there were, like, many indigenous people who did serve, like, very prominently with the Continental Army. You know, the big famous example are the Mohican descended people of Stockbridge, Massachusetts. You know, there was a lot of support, actually, for the American cause among the culturally assimilated tribespeople of southern New England, like the Wampanoag, the Pequot, and the Mohican. And the Stockbridge Indians, as they were known, served in, like, the Siege of Boston, Benedict Arnold's fleet at Valcour Bay, the Battle of Saratoga, and many, many other American conflicts, and were sort of renowned for their, like, ferociousness in battle, you know. And it's interesting because, you know, British accounts where they'd come across, you know, the Stockbridge Indians' corpses or whatever on the battlefield remarked about how they still retained a lot of their traditional dress. And this was even after they'd been living in a mission town for almost 50 years at that point. And so they retained a lot of their traditional dress, a lot of their traditional customs, but they were Christians and they were Americans. And they identified very much with the American cause. You know, and their ferociousness was, like, no more in effect than in probably the most disastrous battle that they took part in, which was in what is today the Bronx, when they were serving under, I believe it was General Horatio Gates. And the Stockbridge Indian Company under Abraham Ninham, who was the sachem at that time, was caught in a British ambush in what is today Van Cortlandt Park, I believe. At that point, it was just, you know, rural New York. And about 40 of them were just cut down ruthlessly, and they fought like hell. I mean, they pulled people from their horses, they were tomahawking British officers, but the sachem and all of his sons were killed at that battlefield. So, you know, they really shed blood for the American cause in a really big way. But ultimately, whether indigenous people sided with the Continental Army or not, unfortunately, that really didn't spare them from the consequences of the American victory. And kind of what I mean by that is that, you know, the British didn't regard Native Americans as equals, like by any means, right? In fact, there's a famous quote by Edmund Burke, you know, he was the guy, I think, who did that quote that was like, evil triumphs when good men do nothing.
Yeah.
So here's another zinger from Edmund Burke. So he said this sarcastically when somebody else in Parliament suggested that the British use indigenous allies in the fight against the Americans.
Suppose there was a riot on Tower Hill. What would the keeper of His Majesty's lions do? Would he not fling open the dens of wild beasts and address them thus? My dear lions, my humane bears, my sentimental wolves, my tender-hearted hyenas, go forth. But I exhort you, as you are Christians and members of a civilized society, to take care not to hurt any man, woman, or child.
So, you know, this pretty disgusting, you know, opinion aside, right? The British did, in fact, you know, their vision for their American empire basically had a place for Native Americans in it, you know? They wanted to utilize native power structures and use the Native Americans for their own ends to kind of support them and entrench their power. But the Americans did not view it that way, right? They just wanted indigenous people gone. During the war itself, like George Washington and the Continental Army realized very quickly that manning forts on the frontier in defense against indigenous raids was like a losing strategy. You know, it just required a lot of manpower and a lot of time and like long enlistments and stuff like that. They realized that it was much more effective to basically get a large army on a limited campaign, physically march into hostile indigenous towns and burn it to the ground and destroy their food, right?
Wow.
So when winter rolled around, then these communities would essentially be starving, you know, and they knew they couldn't go toe to toe against line infantry in open battlefield, so they had to like retreat, basically let this happen, let their food get destroyed, and then winter would come around, they would huddle in like places like Fort Niagara, you know, which is controlled by the British. So, you know, you would see these, you know, essentially this refugee camp outside of this British fort by people who were displaced by American soldiers, you know, who would, you know, be reduced to eating only like salt meat or the occasional deer that wasn't scared away by the fighting. And because they didn't have any diversity in their diets, they got sick, they got malnourished, and, you know, there were multiple famines across the eastern woodlands. A lot of very famous famines happening in like Cherokee country around this time. Thomas Jefferson expressed this kind of, oh, who will rid me of this turbulent priest type of view about the Shawnee. And that inspired Kentucky militia to, you know, who had heard Jefferson say explicitly, I want them gone or exterminated, to go into a Shawnee village when the men were all out hunting and murder all the women and children. And in fact, on George Washington's orders in Haudenosaunee or Iroquois country, the 4th Pennsylvania Militia Regiment in 1779, I believe, marched into a village, destroyed all the corn, and one of the participants, one of the Pennsylvania soldiers, later boasted to a friend, and we have a direct quote on this, that as they were mowing the fields of corn, they found small children hidden in them, and they impaled them with their bayonets and held them up to see how they would twist and turn on the end of their muskets.
So what this boils down to is the American Revolutionary War just ramped up the violence and war against the First Nations that was already happening, but made it just degrees worse.
Yeah, and you know, on that note, we should demonstrate this tomahawk. We've actually got a ballistic gel torso that we're going to be using it on.
I forgot it.
What the fuck, man? You forgot?
Right here, and I forgot it.
You forgot the fucking torso? That was your one job. What the fuck's the matter with you?
I brought the guns.
You brought 2 of the guns. The other one is mine.
And a tomahawk.
Oh my God, you had one fucking job. It's fine. Just use it on me. Just demonstrate it on me.
We were just talking about how these are effective weapons. I think it'll kill you, man.
What are you talking about? Don't be an idiot. Come on, just do it.
Are you sure?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right.
Oh, no, wait.
Well, if you want to pay for Andy's funeral expenses, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Atun-Shei Films. If you like the fact that I finally got this video to end, you can support me at patreon.com/InRangeTV. Maybe for the next video, we'll chop up some fascists.